she vanished when she was supposed to shine the brightest. In the early 90s, Angie Hart was the ethereal voice that floated through every teenager's stereo, the sound of innocence wrapped in melancholy. As the frontwoman of Frente, she sang with a kind of fragile purity that made the world stop and listen. But behind that whisper-soft delivery was a storm silently brewing, one that would eventually consume her from the inside out. After Frente split at the peak of their fame, Angie didn't pivot to a solo triumph like many expected. Instead, she disappeared. No farewell tour, no dramatic exit, just silence. And when she finally spoke years later, what she revealed shocked even her most devoted fans. "I lost myself completely," she once said in a rare interview. "Everything felt hollow, like I'd been emptied out and no one noticed." This wasn't just the story of a band breaking up. It was the story of a young woman who was never prepared for the spotlight, whose identity had been shaped and shattered by music, fame, and a relationship tangled in art and heartbreak. Angie Hart's mental collapse after Frente dissolved wasn't a footnote. It was a reckoning. What really happened when the music stopped? What emotional toll did the sudden fame, fragile love, and creative pressure take on her soul? In this episode, we dive into the hidden scars behind the smile, the ghost notes behind the melodies, and the quiet unraveling of one of Australia's most haunting voices. Australia, 1991. Amid a music scene dominated by pub rock and grunge-heavy guitars, a delicate voice cut through the noise like morning light through mist. Frente wasn't like anything else on the radio. And at the center of that sound was Angie Hart, a petite redhead with a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet powerful enough to stop you in your tracks. Born in Adelaide and raised in Melbourne, Angie Hart didn't seem destined for stardom. In fact, she was the quiet type, more observer than performer. But when she met guitarist Simon Austin while working at a vegetarian cafe, something clicked. The two began writing songs, playful, intimate, achingly pure, and formed Frente in 1989. Within 2 years, they were catapulted into the national spotlight. Their breakout EP World showcased a new kind of vulnerability in Australian pop. It was their 1992 debut album, Marvin the Album, that made them household names. Songs like Ordinary Angels and Accidentally Kelly Street felt refreshingly simple, yet layered with emotional nuance. And then came the unexpected, a stripped-down acoustic cover of New Order's bizarre love triangle. That cover became a global hit. Suddenly, Frente was touring the US, doing late-night TV shows and getting airplay in countries they'd never even been to. For Angie, it was all too much, too fast. At just 20 years old, she was being labeled as the voice of a generation, a media darling with an image to uphold. But behind the pixie-like charisma and soft-spoken interviews was someone quietly unraveling. What most didn't know was that the heart of Frente wasn't just music. It was romance. Angie and Simon weren't just bandmates, they were lovers. The songwriting process was deeply intertwined with their relationship, making every performance a kind of emotional exposure. When the love frayed, so did the music. Tensions grew, and by 1997, after their sophomore album failed to replicate the first success, Frente disbanded. But the story didn't end there. In fact, that's when the real unraveling began. Angie Hart's retreat from the public eye was subtle but telling. Interviews dried up, appearances stopped. For nearly a decade, she seemed to vanish. What had been a promising starlet now became a question mark in Australian music history. Only later did fragments of her truth begin to surface. In scattered interviews, Angie hinted at the emotional cost of her early fame, the confusion of identity, the loss of self, and the deep psychological toll of having her personal and professional worlds implode simultaneously. This wasn't just the story of a band that couldn't handle the pressure. It was the story of a woman whose soul was tethered to a sound, a partner, and a spotlight that left her burnt out and broken. What happens when your identity is built on a dream that stops being yours? Before the world ever knew her name, Angie Hart was just a girl lost in lyrics. She grew up in a religious family, singing in church choirs, surrounded by hymns and modesty. Music at first was a private solace, not a stage for exposure. But life had different plans. Her encounter with Simon Austin was both serendipitous and catalytic. At the tiny cafe where she worked, they bonded over music, poetry, and a mutual desire to create something intimate yet unfiltered. What started as a creative partnership quickly became something more, a relationship of shared dreams and emotional dependency. Together, they formed Frente, and in just a few years, the duo transformed from coffee shop songwriters into international pop darlings. The early success was intoxicating. Ordinary Angels became a national anthem of gentle rebellion. Accidentally Kelly Street, with its deliberately whimsical title, turned into an ironic symbol of naive joy. Angie was hailed as the angelic voice of indie pop, and her style, loose dresses, bare feet, childlike stage presence, became a cultural imprint. But even in those golden years, cracks began to show. Angie often described feeling disconnected from the way the industry packaged her. She was promoted as sweet, quirky, and wholesome, but inside, she was deeply introspective, emotionally complex, and uncomfortable with being turned into a brand. The turning point came with the success of Bizarre Love Triangle. It was supposed to be a throwaway cover, just a live favorite. Instead, it became their most recognized song, charting in the US, UK, and beyond. Suddenly, Frente was not just a cult Australian act, they were a global phenomenon. But fame has a way of magnifying what's already broken. The emotional strain between Angie and Simon deepened. Being on tour meant living in confined spaces, under constant pressure, with unresolved romantic tension hanging like static between them. During the making of their second album, Shape, 1996, the creative synergy began to falter. Angie wanted more control. Simon felt the band's original charm slipping. Critics were lukewarm. Sales dipped. What once felt like a shared heartbeat now felt like two rhythms pulling away from each other. When Frente officially broke up in 1997, the public explanation was polite, creative differences. But privately, Angie was shattered. The band was not just her career, it was her identity, her love story, her entire adult life up to that point. The loss was existential. For a while, she tried to keep moving. She relocated to the US and started experimenting with new sounds. She even collaborated with Joss Whedon on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, contributing vocals to the episode Conversations with Dead People. But the spotlight didn't follow her. Something had shifted, not just in the audience, but within herself. She later described this period as a fog. She didn't know what kind of artist she was anymore. The applause had stopped, but the silence was even louder. There were rumors of breakdowns, of retreats into isolation. She avoided interviews, avoided stages. Even music, for a time, felt like a betrayal. For fans, Angie's absence was a mystery. For Angie, it was survival. In the rare moments when Angie Hart has spoken about her descent, the words carry the weight of years spent pretending everything was fine. I felt like I was playing a version of myself, she once confessed, a version that had been written by other people. After the disbandment of Frente, she found herself drifting, not just away from fame, but away from herself. What the public saw as a graceful exit was, in truth, a slow collapse. The emotional scaffolding that had held her up, music, love, identity, had all been torn away at once. Left in its place was a haunting emptiness. She spoke of days spent unable to get out of bed, of an oppressive silence where creativity used to be. It wasn't depression the way people think, she once said. It was like my soul had gone offline. The truth was, Angie Hart wasn't just mourning a band. She was mourning the loss of belief in herself, in the purity of art, in the idea that music could heal instead of harm. The intense emotional intimacy that made Frente songs so resonant had become a weapon turned inward. Every lyric she had once sung now felt like an echo of a person she could no longer access. There was also the matter of Simon Austin. While their breakup wasn't splashed across tabloids, it was deeply embedded in every chord they wrote together. The collapse of their relationship meant the collapse of their creative dynamic. And because their love and their music were never separate, neither could be mourned cleanly. Behind closed doors, Angie's breakdown was real. She moved to the United States with her new husband, Jesse Tobias, a guitarist who'd played with Morrissey and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Together, they formed the duo Splendid, a new beginning, at least in theory. But Splendid never caught fire. Their debut album, Have You Got a Name for It, was shelved in the US due to label issues. Another artistic heartbreak. And then came an unexpected moment of visibility, her haunting performance on Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the episode Conversations with Dead People, 2002. For many fans, it was a surreal reunion, the voice from their youth, now singing in a graveyard scene, almost ghost-like. It was art imitating life, or perhaps Angie's life slipping into fiction. Yet even this resurgence didn't reignite her career. Angie seemed to drift further from the spotlight, choosing smaller venues, more intimate projects, and ultimately a quiet life, in contrast to the whirlwind that marked her 20s. The media never really chased the story of Angie's unraveling. There was no scandal, no overdose, no public meltdown. But the emotional toll was just as profound. Maybe even more so because it was invisible. What made it all the more tragic was how deeply her fans had connected to her vulnerability and how alone she felt when that vulnerability became too heavy to carry. And yet, Angie never lashed out at the industry. She never blamed anyone. In her soft, measured words, she spoke of the importance of boundaries, of reclaiming agency, of learning how to protect your inner life when the world wants to turn it into a product. She once said, "I wasn't broken, I was just misused." The line lingers like a final lyric. Looking back at Angie Hart's story, Aussie Uncovered sees not just the rise and fall of a pop icon, but a portrait of vulnerability in its most raw and beautiful form. In a music industry obsessed with reinvention, survival often demands toughness, branding, control. But Angie Hart offered none of that. What she gave instead was honesty, fragility, a voice so bare it felt like a confession. And perhaps that's what ultimately made her so unprepared for the weight that followed. The pressure of sudden fame, the collapse of a romantic and creative partnership, the expectation to keep performing joy when your internal world has gone dark. Few artists are handed so much so quickly and expected to carry it all with a smile. Angie Hart tried, and when she couldn't anymore, she stepped back. Some may interpret that as weakness. We see it as strength, choosing silence over spectacle, choosing healing over headlines, choosing small stages, honest songs, and private peace over chasing a spotlight that once burned her. That's not failure, that's reclamation. While Frente is often remembered for its quirky charm and radio-friendly melodies, the soul of that band and of Angie's work since has always been the undercurrent of sadness, the almost imperceptible ache beneath the prettiness. That's what gave her songs longevity. They weren't just hits, they were heartbeats. We often celebrate artists who return stronger, louder, more famous. But what about those who return softer, wiser, and more self-aware? Angie Hart never chased a comeback. She redefined what survival looked like on her own terms. And if you listen closely to her later songs, you'll hear it. Not bitterness, but clarity. Not regret, but distance. As if she finally found the version of herself that fame once swallowed whole. Now we want to hear from you. What do you remember about Frente? About that voice that seemed to float above everything? Did you ever wonder where Angie went after it all ended? And do you believe some artists are too pure for the industry they're thrown into? Or was this simply the price of early success and emotional exposure? Let us know what you feel, what you remember, and what you think she represents in the larger story of Australian music. Some voices never shout, they whisper, and in that whisper, they carry more truth than 1,000 anthems. Angie Hart didn't fade away, she simply stepped out of view. And maybe that's why her story still lingers, not as a headline or a scandal, but as a feeling, a memory tucked inside a melody, the kind that catches you off guard on a quiet night, like hearing Bizarre Love Triangle at a supermarket and suddenly remembering how it felt to be 17, heartbroken and hopeful all at once. She was never built for the machinery of fame, but she was built for something more enduring, connection. Honest, fragile, imperfect connection. Her music didn't ask for applause, it asked to be felt, and decades later, it still is. Frente may have disbanded, the tours may have ended, the big lights dimmed, but somewhere, someone is still pressing play. Still being comforted by that voice, still hearing their own sadness echoed in hers. That's legacy. That's survival. Not every story ends with a comeback. Some stories survive in smaller, quieter ways, through the hearts they helped steady, the memories they became a soundtrack to. And some voices, like Angie Hart's, were never meant to rise above the noise. They were meant to speak directly to the quiet parts inside us. Some stories are never told, but now you know.